Hi. It's really, really nice to meet all of you. I'm excited to be here with all of you talking about Caribbean, well, it's children's literature. Um, I my name is Serah Acham. I am a past student of UWE's MFA program, and while I was there, I actually started and finished my first draft of my own children's novel. And the theme of Campus Literature Week this year is cultivating legacy with words. And I just thought it just makes sense to include children's literature in this theme because that's kind of where the cultivation starts when they're little. So I think what I'll do is just give each of you an little intro for everyone who's going to be listening, and then we could get into it. So we are chatting here with Imam Baksh, who is an award-winning Guyanese author known for blending folklore with fantasy in his middle grade and YA fiction. His novel, Children of the Spider, won the Code Burt Award for Caribbean Literature, and his novel, Dark of the Sea, was a finalist. Tracey Baptiste is a Trinidadian American author, best known for her Jumbies series, in which she reimagines Caribbean folklore in thrilling modern fantasy adventures for young readers. She's also written extensively across fiction and nonfiction, ensuring that Caribbean stories remain at the forefront of children's literature. And we're also speaking with Peter Kalu, who's a British Nigerian author based in the UK. His diverse body of work spans YA fiction, poetry, and theatre, and his YA novels, including The Silent Striker, Zombie 11, and Being Me, tackle themes of identity, race, and belonging with a powerful contemporary voice that resonates with young readers. Okay, so to get us started, I thought we could talk about how we're able to bring our rich cultural backgrounds to life for young readers. So, how do you each approach creating stories that reflect heritage, identity, and a sense of place? Anyone could jump in.
I'll start, sure. I feel like growing up in Trinidad and listening to all of the stories that I listened to growing up, um, really kind of set the stage for where I am now, and what I want to do. Because while there are so many stories that come to us, and so many of them are from Europe and from the United States, for example, we had a really great um, group of stories that, like nobody was really talking about, and they were, to me, as good or better than everything else that I was hearing. So I just kind of dug into my own stories and the stories that I grew up listening to and started really playing with them to see what I could get out of those as a creator. And even though I thought it was going to be stories that really just kind of interested me and my family and my kids, it turned out that, like, these were just as universal as any other stories that were out there, and a lot of people have responded really well to them, to the point where I am still writing a lot of stories that have a very, very strong Caribbean base. The new series, Moco Magic, is about Moco Jumbies. But that very first story, that first Jumbies book, is still the best-selling book that I have. And it continues to do extremely well year after year, proving that the stories that we have are stories that everybody wants to hear.
Um, can I? the, how so you're in the States now, do you find that your audience, people who buy your books, are international throughout
Yes.
the span? I think
Yes,
that's really cool.
absolutely. For sure. And I get invited to speak like all over the world. I recently
Yeah,
just got an invitation to speak in Frankfurt. So these are stories that people love everywhere.
I love that. Pete, Imam, anyone?
Right. So for me, I think one of the issues is you're looking for your competitive advantage as a writer. That's an economic term, but you're always thinking to yourself, if I'm telling a story, first of all, what is it that I see in my world that's special that I want to say to the rest of the audience, the people outside my country or people within my country? What is it I want to tell a story about? And that's the base. But then as you go along, you start to pick out details and you start to think, well, what will set this story as something special or give it an edge? And you start to think of things you see only in your community, and you know you haven't seen it outside your community. The way people speak, maybe it could be events that happen, celebrations, or just the way people interact could be part of it. For example, the way the criminal underworld works might be different in your little part of the world. So then you start to think about how your world is different and could be a selling point for your story. And I don't mean selling point purely as a marketing term. I mean it from the point of view of the reader is going to see this and think, oh, this is fun, this is new. And so while you're starting from a base of saying, I just want to tell a story about my world, you always end up in that position where you start to select based on what you know is different and what is fun. And I'm fun in a very broad sense, of course, because sometimes you're exploring rather dark things. But and that's another thing I think is important. There is in everyone's locality issues that are touchy and dark. And I've made a special effort not to tone those things down because I'm showing it to the outside world. And the feedback I get from readers that makes me feel happy is many people read when they come back to me and they tell me, well, this is what I enjoyed about your book. They appreciate the fact that I didn't try to soften the image of my portrayal of my people or that my country. You know, I'm not letting nationalism or patriotism get in the way of saying to people, this is the life I see around. And so you get a sense of authenticity, I think, that comes out of being willing to portray the dirtier parts, the less honest parts of your world. I don't want to use the word corruption, but that is some of it. Um, and so you get the light and the dark together. And like with most things, contrast helps to make things sharper. And so when I say to people, this is the joy of my world, they understand why it's joyful because they've seen also the sadness of my world or the fears of my world.
Ooh,
Well, thank you.
yeah, thank you. I recently finished reading Dark of the Sea, and exactly what you're saying is what I found. I saw that I really appreciated the uh, the authenticity. I saw it. I mean, I've never been to Guyana, but in Trinidad as well, we also have the school, um, those differences in schools, the ones that are for those who do very well or who have connections and money, and those who don't do it very well and don't have those things. And yeah, it was real. And then of course your religion you bring into it. I saw it. So that was, yeah, that was well done. And yes, it fits. It really fits with legacy and the theme. It,
Yeah, okay. I think that listening to Tracy and Imam, I was thinking, okay, what is it that connects all my writing? And I decided while listening that perhaps it is hybridity and the sense that there is no true key essence to any people, nation, individual or culture. You know there's always a huge number of things merging hybridizing at all times. And I guess, as a diasporan voice, there is a tendency, I feel, in literature to drift towards essentialism. And so much of my work tends to be the celebration of hybridity and the examination of attempts to suppress this for some kind of essential source or uh, way of being. And so, if you take one of my novels, Being Me, it almost says everything they need to say in its title. That the girl who's the voice Adele of Being Me has so many different aspects to her, and one or other aspect is constantly being suppressed by one group of people or another group of people, and she's like, "Get away! I am me in all my full glory. You cannot suppress me." And that as a story seemed to translate well internationally. I know that I was delighted to touch upon Imam's idea of market. I was delighted to get a check from buyers in Ghana. Oh, it wasn't a huge check, but it's a lovely thing to know that people are actually buying your book in Ghana and it's resonating with them in some way. So yeah, that's the feel that I have for what connects and what the heritage idea, the idea of heritage and multiplicity is I think what's at the common thread through my books.
Yeah. And what I found with all of with the three of you write in different genres. How do you pick that genre that best serves the story that you want to tell?
Yeah, yes, I guess I don't, for myself, I don't start with a genre. I tend to start with the idea, and exactly as you say, Serah, I think how does this work best? So one of the colleagues at UE who was actually on the screen 10 minutes ago, Roger, you may know he's also a musician and a singer, and I was working on a poem, and I thought, you know what, this should be sung. It's not a short story; it should be sung. And we got a team of musicians together. We made a lovely song really out of it, which is available on YouTube, I think. So I don't really start with by saying I'm going to write for young adult fiction or I'm going to write for middle grade fiction. I start with what is it that I'm trying to say and who would best embody it and what are its energies? I don't know how the other writers have found.
I think. Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, I feel like I think similarly. Like, like an idea comes, story comes, and in the development of that story in your head, you figure out, oh, this is going to be the right audience for it. Because I write, sometimes stories come and I know immediately that that's a picture book because I can see that it is definitely for really little kids. I can sort of see them sort of consuming that story in somebody's lap as somebody else is reading to them. Some stories come and I can tell that this is the kind of book that a kid is going to want to go off and like sort of find a nice spot and read it by themselves. So this is definitely going to be for an older reader, an experienced reader. And then there are stories, usually for me, short stories that come that I know is definitely for adults, that this is not for little kids. I'm dealing with far more mature themes. I'm dealing with far more mature kind of events that this is definitely not going to be for younger kids. So, the idea always comes first. And then the audience always comes right after it. It's like the idea, the audience, who does it go to fairly quickly for me.
In terms of genre, I just have a brain that works a little bit more fantastically. In fact, I've often had people say to me, along the lines of, when are you going to write something normal? Because sometimes there's this pressure. They said, you could write about life as it is and be serious. And I don't know if I'm avoiding being serious by putting fantastical stuff in it. And I think sometimes what happens is that there's a modern tint on this idea of fantasy and imagination beyond reality that makes people think you're not being serious. But that last book I published, the last novel I published, that's a very serious book. We're talking about themes of uh, happiness, suicide. What is your purpose in life? How do you find a purpose in life? And how do you realize that it is time to leave where you were birthed and grew up and decide that this is not all I should have in my life? There are so many mature themes in that. So the fantasy stuff, I don't know if it's something because I spent so much time as a child reading fairy tales, fantasy, um, science fiction, maybe it's just that it permanently encoded my brain in that way. And so I'm unable to write a program without that code in it, so to speak. Hardwired, I think is the term. So when I write, there's almost always some kind of fantastical element, or I don't have an interest. So I'm always going to be writing in that vein. In terms of, is it a children's book? Is it an adult book? Usually I go by the age of the character involved. So my last book was a picture book. The character is 7 years old, and it's a picture book for people around that age. And the novel before that, it was a character who's 15, and I had this idea that the people who would read it would be about 15. So you always kind of cater the scope of the story, the events of the story, especially with The Dark of the Sea. So much of it was centered around school life. And I know I could write an adult book, a book for grown-ups about school life, but nothing stopping them from reading it and getting a lot out of it, and many have. But I tend to center the audience consideration around the protagonist age as I see this. And usually the protagonist age comes out of how you imagine the story at first. And that's maybe a trap, I don't know, but that's how I've been operating so far.
I do want to say something to what Imam said about the idea of fantasy dealing with difficult subjects. And I think the reason that I gravitate toward fantasy and science fiction more than I do towards contemporary is because I can address really difficult things, I find, much easier in fantasy than I could if I was coming at it straight. It sort of allows you a little bit of ease in dealing with really tough subjects, I find. In the Jumpy series, we're dealing with people who were enslaved and forcibly brought to the Americas, and and that is something that I don't think I would have been able to do straight for kids. So I was very grateful to be able to do it in this sort of fairy tale format. Yeah.
Yes, that's actually what I was going to kind of ask about, because you all do touch on some very serious issues and you're able to do it in a way that's engaging and easy for kids to just get into and sit with. I think that's important. Um, how so right now we also have, well, kids are not just there's not just that's not the only medium that's around for kids right now. There's social media, there's gaming, so all the tech. Do you find that, well, how do you write, approach your stories to compete with that? Do you find you need to compete with it?
Well,
I'm definitely not trying to compete, but I'm going to let Peter go.
I've gone over to the other side. I write programs. I write games for young people as well. So I write using a digital platform called Twine storytelling platform. And I recently was working on to use technical terms, the RPG, a role play game using Unity engine, which is the engines of a lot of the big players in the games markets, in collaboration with the American University of Beirut, and a coding company there. So I've always enjoyed media, and I'm other media, not as opposed to the pen and paper, keyboard kind of conventional writing. I've never felt that they're in opposition. I think that they bring out different things. One of the greatest things that the writing games does is it throws into question the idea of the linear story where there's just one ending, because most of the games you're writing, there are 16 or 32 endings, as many endings as you want, and it does rather blow your mind as a writer that you're no longer going to have to head towards this single conclusion. It's
That's
fun.
cool. That's pretty cool. That makes me wonder. We're talking about um literature here, but do you, I mean, that's also storytelling. Do you find that like our stories, diverse stories, are easily accessible or found in that medium?
There's a bias, of course, because a lot of, from my perspective, based in the UK, a lot of the stories that I encountered were white-centered and white-coded. In fact, there's a book. It's got a very dramatic title called "Kill the Overseer." It's about how we might write global majority or diverse or black stories rather than the mainstream stories. And yeah, I did read through that and picked up some ideas from the author. So yeah, it is a battle sometimes to get these stories into the river of literature, and to find the audiences for them. One of the greatest moments I experienced was at a speculative fiction festival in London, at which I brought one of the games. It's got a very strange name, but then games often do. It's called Simulacrum Funk, and I allowed it. What I do at these kind of conferences and festivals is I don't play the game myself. I know how to play it. I let the users play it as if they just bought the game. They're just trying it out. And I remember someone gesticulating from the back of the audience. Who wrote this? Because of the things that were being revealed through the game, So, and that was such a compliment because it meant that I hadn't abandoned my soul as a writer to code stuff up, that you can write beautifully well and meaningfully in that digital format. But at the same time, there is something about the conventional form which I feel means it will never die out. There was a moment in literature where we were doing multiple endings within a book, choice
I
games.
remember that.
Yeah, choose your own adventure.
Yes,
Yes,
that's right. Yeah.
I love those books as a kid, and
So
it
did
was
I.
always it was always that weird thing where you would make what looked like the right choice and it would end badly for you. Like so frustrating.
Classic, yes.
But I've been fascinated by this idea of the digital, because there's something called lit RPG that's popular online, and I've tried a few and I enjoyed them. Unfortunately, I have a few eye problems, so it's difficult for me to get into it as much as I want. But it is a field I think is ripe for exploitation, and there is a lot of room there for Caribbean people to step in and provide stories for the global audience. There's a space that we can fill up.
I think that'd be really exciting. Do you know if there are any
No, so
games
lit
developed?
RPG in particular is something that has mostly come out of Japan. And so most of what you'll find with lit RPG is Japanese characters, Japanese settings, and stories tailored to Japanese tastes. There's a lot of Americans starting up, but they also tend to copy the Japanese style and even have Japanese characters. But like any art form, as people adopt it, they'll start to adapt to it. And then the next phrase I've heard is adept. You become adept at it, and then you make it your own. And so I would be, when I look at these other media, games, these hybrid platforms like a lit RPG, which is basically a giant choose your own adventure, I see it as an opportunity for expansion of literature. It's not competition to literature. And I have started exploring how I could uh, write stories or make stories in that space. I don't know if the word writing stories even applies in that kind of environment. Crafting might be more. I've already like looked at how I would have to pursue something like that, and it starts out with flowcharts. So, if they choose this, then I have to go here. But then if they choose this, I come back to this point, and yeah. So it reminds me of math almost in a way.
Programming.
Yes.
Yeah.
I don't know. I as someone who was an editor of the flowchart type games, I get quite some highly innumerate writers working for me who just say, I don't care about your flowcharts. I'm going to write the story how I feel. And then I end up having to cut and paste it all and stitch it all up and work out the loop. But one thing that happens is that you do start making editorial decisions. And whereas the writer of the conventional text, the YA novel, the middle grade novel, is fully in control of how that story rolls, I think the editors of games start to become much more powerful than the writers, in the sense that we've got to make sure the game works as a game. There's a slightly different thing going on than just telling the story. It's a navigation of the game. Is a piece of fun in itself. For instance, some users will say, "Well, I know it's terrible, but some of them will say." We need to shoot something up now. Let's shoot something up. And we're like, I'm telling a story. No, let me hit the birds. And it's so there's a sort of compromise or a hybridity to what you're doing as a craftsperson, as Imam says, as opposed to as a writer. So there is, but in terms of market, in terms of the finance, I do think that games is huge, and I expect it's larger now than literature itself.
Really?
Sadly.
Yes, I tend to agree.
I mean, I get so I feel like I might know more people who are gamers than readers. But I've always been intrigued by the storytelling that is in these games. Yeah. Okay, so when you write our stories, do you think about the global audience? Do you think about how to, I mean, you're talking about the economics. So I'm guessing yes, Imam, but also I know like when you're trying to tell a story, sometimes that story goes where it wants to go. So
There are things, especially with language, that I find you have to make adjustments with. So this is something that happened recently. I mentioned my last book was a children's book, and there's a scene where two schoolgirls are going to school, and one of their dogs is trying to grab pine tarts from them. And she's saying to the girl, tell your dog to stop trying to grab my pine tart. But the dialogue I wrote was, tell Bruno he can't have my pineapple tarts. And this is a book being written for a publisher in London that is expected to have worldwide distribution, but it's for a sub-line that's supposed to focus on Caribbean culture and supposed to be Caribbean centered. So I'm right from the get-go, I'm looking at both audiences. So a book club read my book and they came back to me and they're like, why are you calling this thing pineapple tarts? They're pine tarts. So I had to explain to them, yes, but if a British person or an American person reads my book, for them, pine is not pineapple. They're thinking of, if they see the word pine tarts, they're probably thinking of something made with pine nuts, like pesto. And then they're going to be saying, why are these Caribbean children eating pine from a conifer so to kind of get around that, I came up with what ultimately ended up being a little awkward, which was I call them pineapple tarts. So the Caribbean people know what I'm talking about. It is a Caribbean thing, but that word doesn't quite hit naturally for the Caribbean audience. But for someone from outside the Caribbean audience, they never feel that. So that's a place where I steer the story to cater more to an outside audience than the Caribbean audience. And once in a while,
go ahead. I was going to say, did a part of your soul leave you as you made that compromise?
as someone who has been eating my mother's pine tarts with great enthusiasm since I was a child, and have never called it pineapple tarts until I wrote that book, yes, it was painful. But there are things like I write my dialogue in Creole. That's something I put a lot of effort into, is that my characters in Guyana should speak with some Creole. And when I notice that certain words in the Creole can get confused for other words, or they sound too similar to English words, or there's room for ambiguity, I'll step back and I'll find a way to phrase it that is still Creole, but it's probably not what a Creole speaker would choose for the first way of saying it, but it's still genuinely Creole. So there's always that thing in the back of your mind where you're seeing it as both audiences would. And in a way, it's like writing a sci-fi story. If an American writer is writing for an American audience, or let's say Tolkien. Tolkien is writing about Middle Earth for a British audience, and he's writing about elves. He'll explain the world of the elves. He'll explain a little bit of their history and try to ease the reader into seeing that world from the perspective of an outsider. And oftentimes I find like I'm explaining my country like I would a fantasy world to the outsider. And that comes with compromises. And I know a lot of places in recent times have come up with controversy over that. I know, for example, in Indian literature, there is a lot of talk about, do you write about India for the white gaze, or do you write about India for Indians who already know all this stuff and you don't have to explain it to them before you get into it? I think for me, because I've always had this idea that I'm going to be part of an international conversation, my approach as a writer has always been, hey, I have cool stories to tell the world. I've never just thought of myself as writing for my local audience. I'm happy to make that compromise. But I could see why some people might say, no, I'm writing for the people who live here. I want to speak directly to them. And if an outsider gets it or not, doesn't matter to me. So it's all about, I think, how you see the role of your stories. And so for me, I do take that international audience into consideration. And I'm always conscious of letting them see my world in a way they understand it without changing the authenticity of what I present. And once in a while, I screw up like with the pine tarts.
I mean, I feel like because I write mostly for an American audience, my publishers are all American. I'm always thinking about that, even though a lot of my stories are set in the Caribbean or they feature Caribbean speakers. I always have to think about, how is an American child, an American ear going to hear these certain things? Fortunately, I've had most of my books become audiobooks. So I have been really lucky in that I've been able to talk to the audiobook narrators and have conversations about how certain things should be pronounced, so that even if I spell a word conventionally, but they pronounce it with a Trini accent, it's sort of the best of both worlds at that point, that you can hear it, this certain way, which is doesn't necessarily match exactly the conventional spelling. And also when I go and I do events, I love reading parts of the book where I can then fall right back into my Trinidadian accent, and the audience gets a chance to hear what it really sounds like, what it's really supposed to sound like. But I often send, schools or classes or kids or whomever to the audiobooks to even get like just a little bit, like even if they just listen to a sample of it, so that they can hear what it is really supposed to sound like. Because they're not necessarily going to get that from the way that I have written the dialogue. I do try to put in spellings that hint at that, but I definitely don't go all the way, because I know I have to make sure that an American audience can read it really easily.
That's that's a topic that comes up all the time, and when I was doing the MFA and even in like workshops after, and that's something that I really, as I was writing, really had to think about and figure out, how do I spell it? Because I want to say, I want to say authentic. My novel is based in Trinidad and Tobago, so we have to sound like we sound, but also I would like it to be accessible. So that's like I guess, hot topic. I don't know if that'll ever really stop being a hot topic. So yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah, it's a difficult one to navigate, and I think every writer will choose their own path of between. I think in Scotland, there's a story of a very famous writer who writes almost phonetically as say Glaswegians speak, which is very different from how somebody in, say, London may speak, or somebody in Essex. And they were very proud of it because it had been rendered authentically into this pattern of language. But when that very famous writer went to their father, who spoke even more authentically than the son, their father said, "I can't understand a word. I can't read it." and so there is this struggle between authenticity and transparency or something, where you really want the reader to not have to struggle over every line to decode it. And in some ways, you feel maybe I'm conceding territory, and I don't want to do that. Let them struggle, but in the end, they're not going to read your book then. So it's difficult. It is. I know one writer who said that he doesn't spell phonetically too much, but he uses the rhythms, and by the rhythm, people can pick up the speech, the sound. And I thought that was an interesting. I know another writer who runs everything through one of these softwares that tells you how accessible the language is, whether somebody with a reading age of 10 can read what you've written or not. And that's another compromise in a
I
way.
think it's a Lexile score. I think that's what it is. When I was in educational publishing, we used it a lot. We used Lexile scores. Yeah.
And you feel, should I do that? What if I get a really bad score? It's the things you have to do. And now with AI, AI can read the entire novel and say, must try harder.
My own experiences with that is that the barrier is not that great. And I know, for example, there are books like A Clockwork Orange, or what's that one that was set in Edinburgh with all the drug use?
Trainspotting.
Trainspotting. Yeah. So Trainspotting and Clockwork Orange both became giant hits, and they have really strange language in them at times, and very, I don't want to say totally uncompromised language, but there is a certain insistence in the language that you have to get how I speak. And the audience has a little bit of turbulence getting into it, but people have told me, once I got used to the Creole, it was easy and it was great. And this is, Americans, British people who've never seen this on the page. They may have heard it, but they've never seen it on the page. And so once you draw them in enough and they can kind of ease themselves into it, they run with it. But I don't know if you can just throw them in with the pure unfiltered stuff. You got to cut it. Am I using too many drug terms? I don't want to reveal anything about my other economic activities.
It is a set of questions that always arise, and certainly with Train Spotting and Clockwork Orange, they were written for adults, and I get the idea that the reader eventually is immersed in the language and can generate the language, understands the conventions of that body of language, and I guess that's an achievement if one can do it for YA. Maybe that's a good research project for someone to attempt it at least. See if you can pull it off. I've never attempted myself to go all the way in the way that say Train Spotting did and just write something where the young people, the children, have to first of all learn. But surely that would be fun too. Give me ideas, Imam.
Yeah, I feel like we would. I think we would have to sort of, ease them in. So like less at the beginning and more as they get used to it. That's probably the way to do it. But yeah, I was thinking about I recently read The Book of Night Women by Marlon James. And, even as a Caribbean speaker, listening to Jamaican patois was, there was a little bit of a learning curve. But again, this is for adults. These are for adult readers who are going to do that work and know that they're going to do that work. A kid reader is going to be like, I can play a video game, I could do something else. A kid reader is going to abandon that really easily unless you do the work of bringing them in slowly. They will just flat out be like, I could be elsewhere.
I get that. Okay, so as we are wrapping up and branching off of that, is there or what advice would you give to emerging writers who want to tell their stories authentically, the culturally rich stories authentically for kids and for teens?
I'll go first so that
yes.
because my advice is useless, so let it get it out of the way and then the others can say something sensible. I would say ignore all the critics, ignore all the editors, and just write the story. Write it how you want to write it. And don't let anybody read it until you've written a first draft, because these critics and others who pour forth their opinions sometimes disrupt the flow and the genesis of what you're trying to do. Just go with you believe in yourself and go for it.
I mean, I absolutely agree that you cannot show anybody your work early, right? It is very, very delicate, very early in the process, and showing that to anybody can really destroy it. I don't even talk about work that I'm doing, because I find that if I'm talking about it, I'm not actually doing it. So I, keep everything very, very close under wraps until I feel like it is solid enough that I can show it to somebody else. And then at that point, I would say you really need to find people who can read it, who actually know what they're talking about. That's the hard part, right? Because you get to a point in a story where you've seen it too much, you don't know what's actually there, because you so much of it is in your head and you don't know what's actually on the page because you're so close to it. So you really need somebody else to take a look at it at that point, but you need somebody who knows what they're doing, right? Which is why, like Yui's MFA program is good. I teach at an MFA program at Lesley University. We actually have had Caribbean people come up to Cambridge, Massachusetts to work there. But you really want to find people who are doing this kind of work, who actually know how to take what you have done, care for it, nurture it, and then help you get to the next place. Because there's a lot of people who are not going to understand what you are trying to do as a Caribbean writer. And I had a lot of that, like that first Jumbies book, that book that everybody buys, that is still my bestseller. Nobody wanted that book because nobody thought that this was a book that was going to sell, right? So I needed to find somebody who understood what it was I was trying to do and supported it. And because publishing is still very white and very Eurocentric, finding that person is going to be a hard ask. So you really do have to do that work to find people who do that.
I think the thing about getting to authenticity within your own culture when you write your story, generally good writing practice will get you 90% of the way there. So that's number one, be a reader. When I look at young people's writing, a lot of the first big flaw I see is that they're trying to write a TV show. They're writing with the visual vocabulary of being a TV watcher. And so they're trying to reproduce that on the page. And that usually results in vague descriptions. It results in a lot of the absence of the internal monologue. It's not there. That sense of being within a person as you move through the story is not there. It's all a very outside perspective, as if you're a voyeur, you're watching through a screen. So you have, as a young writer, to really delve into writing, delve into what people who want to be a writer got into want to be a writer because they're a reader. But I find that as much as a reader as you may be, you're not enough of a reader if you want to be a writer. The other thing is observe. Pay attention to what people say to each other when they're tense. Pay attention to what people say to each other when they're relaxed. Note the differences, and then look at how they move when they're with someone they feel comfortable with. Look at how they move when they're with someone they feel less powerful than. And of course, this is not a very active process. You're not just like making notes like a little reporter all day long, but there's a part in the back of your mind that works that way. And you're like, oh, I never realized that. And you just file it away in a mental cabinet. And you don't use all of it, but it's there for you to access. And then in your local community, there may be a thing that people do with their hands when they're nervous, or there might be a way that people avoid eye contact when there's a certain social situation. There's a scene in The Dark of the Sea where I use that. The boy is being confronted by a teacher, and there's a certain thing that Caribbean students, Guyanese students especially, do when a teacher is yelling at them that American kids don't. American kids, when a teacher is upset at them, they will look that teacher straight in the eye very blatantly, very rudely. Guyanese kids can't do that. They don't have the capacity because of the way they've been raised to stand up to a teacher. And in fact, they seem lost sometimes when they, so I reproduce that because I observed it. I'm like, this is how people in Guyana, kids in Guyana feel powerless before their teachers. And this is what teachers exploit. And so there's a whole scene based around that interaction where I use the observations I had made through a whole lifetime of being in the school system. And I brought that back out in the scene. And there's so many people who have read that scene and they say to me, yeah, that's what it was like, or that's how it is like. So basic good immersion in how people live and what books are like, that will get you a long way forward in being authentic in what you put back on page.
That's all really, really good advice. And I feel like in my own writing, I see where it all would be very helpful. So I think that's a really, really good place to end on. Thank you all so much.
My
Well,
pleasure.
thanks for having
Yeah.
us.